Hey, everybody. Thanks for finishing up the week with us as we continue through the Gospel of John. We're moving into the 11th chapter. Today, the 11th chapter is, again, an interesting chapter. If you were with us when we went through chapter 9, chapter 11 has some similarities in that it all functionally grows out of one story. John is going to tell us a story, and then really the rest of the chapter is kind of anchored into that story. Yeah, actually, even maybe on past it a little bit. So I think it will be a story that is largely familiar. I think if you've hung around in church much, this would be a familiar story. It's also pretty memorable, I think, because of the content. But let's jump in. Verse 1, chapter 11. We'll read 6 verses or so, then we'll try to see what we can find in it. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, in the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death, rather it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God might be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. So just kind of the introduction here, Michael, we have Lazarus, a reference to an event that I think hasn't happened yet in regard to Mary that's coming in the next chapter. We've been, for the last day or so, mentioning signs, a reminder that the scholars who study the book of John say there are 7 major signs. This is the 7th, and I think in some case you'd have to say the pinnacle. It is perhaps the most amazing of the signs. In regard to, you get the sense that the people John is writing to know these folks, that they're known in the community. The effect of the story, though, is that they just kind of drop in. A certain man was ill, Lazarus. I don't think we've had mention of Lazarus yet that I remember, although it's possible that I've forgotten. And we have this very strange moment where Jesus makes this strange pronouncement. Again, to tie back to chapter 9, you might remember that chapter begins with the question of why the man was born blind. And Jesus says, so that the glory of God could be seen. And here we have a similar kind of answer. The illness does not lead to death. It is for God's glory. And John isn't into explaining things to us. He often just lays out a detail that we wish we knew more about. But in this case, he says, because of this pronouncement that Jesus has made, that Jesus stays where he is a couple of days longer. Now, there's some interpretive stuff that we'll have to work out through that lens later in the story. But for now, it doesn't maybe hit us as an important detail, but it sets the stage for everything that's going to come next.
I'm not going to have much to add to this here. I think maybe just one comment that I would make sure we want to know that Jesus continues the 2 threads, really, as this story moves forward. So, and we're going to see more of this as we go. So I'm going to be brief about this. But the first thread is that whenever Jesus is going to prepare to do a miracle, it's in the Gospel of John, never just blanket revelation. It's never just a miracle for a miracle's sake. I think that this is an impression that people have of the Bible that is not entirely helpful and not true. That the telling of miracles in the Bible is not like a sort of record of magician acts. This isn't like, oh, and then he did this other really cool, amazing, you'll never believe it kind of thing. No, in the Gospel of John, the red letters here in verse 4 are really, really an important reminder of the characterization of why Jesus is doing what he does. Here, this idea that illness that Jesus, he already knows where it's going, right? He already has that foreknowledge. That it doesn't lead to death. We have that tip, the idea it's not going to death, though in just a moment we're going to see it go in that direction. Rather, this is for God's glory, so that God may be glorified through it. So it has a way of witnessing to who he is. Jesus already knows what's going to happen, but he's already seen not just the physical action, but the spiritual meaning that will come when it's all corrected. All of this is sort of reaching forward. The other thing I think I just want to point out here is the fact that we would really love to have all of the information about these characters and why they get inserted at the times that they do and all these kinds of things. At the end of the day, you have to remember that all of these encounters with Jesus for John fall under the heading and the purpose of seeing Jesus for who he is. And I think that this story does cause problems for folks, as we're going to see as we go through it. There's some relational things in it that may just seem off to a modern hearer. And just a reminder, Jesus's purpose is, as we have explicitly listed here, Son of God glorified through what's about to come. Well, we should, Clint, be looking and seeing in this entire story how it reveals something uniquely true about who Jesus is, and therefore the one who was sent. And that's not even connecting to the previous theme, and we're going to get into this as we go further in the story. But you got to remember, Jesus was just talking about life, being willing to give up life. So now we've immediately transitioned into the story where a person is at the edge of death. They're nearly at the end of life itself. Those things being grouped in that way, that's not accidental. John's leading us on a journey here.
Yeah, and let's jump into the next chunk, and then we'll come back. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." And the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you. Are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, who was called the twin, said to the other disciples, "Let us go also, that we may die with him." This, I think, is kind of vintage John that we've seen. Jesus makes a statement. The disciples argue with him. Jesus makes a cryptic statement. They don't understand. Then Jesus says a thing that sort of ends the conversation. And interestingly enough, here at the end of the passage, you have Thomas, whose claim to fame is that he, later in the gospel, he doubts. In fact, he often wears the label Doubting Thomas. But here, he says, with an act of faith or courage or whatever it might be, let's go with him. And if we let us go, that we may die with him. So interesting that this same disciple, who is thought of by history as the one who doubts, shows such courage here in this matter. I don't know what we learn from this part of the story, Michael, other than, again, Jesus knows what he's going to do, even to the point of saying, "I'm glad you weren't there. I'm glad I wasn't there, so that you might believe." Because for John, as we've been saying, it's always about belief. It's about how do you respond to what you see Jesus do. And this on-ramp takes us exactly back to that place we've been many times.
So I think a really important detail that he's mentioned here is the fact that right right away here we now see the connection to yesterday's text. So if you weren't with us yesterday, hit the back button, go back to the previous video in the series here. But what's really interesting is notice verse 7. After he says this, he says, "Let's go to Judea again." The disciples say, just so we, the reader, don't forget, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and you want to go back there. Well, let's just skip back here just a ways. Remember here that previously Jesus was talking about being the shepherd, the one who's willing to lay down his life for the sheep, right? You have all of these themes about the one who's willing to give up life for the sake of the others having life. Well, now we immediately transition into this story where Jesus is saying, let's go back to the place where they were trying to take my life. Jesus is living out his teaching. He's willing to do the very thing that he said that a good shepherd should do, except for the fact, and Clint, this is the great overall irony of John. It's not Jesus's time. And so there really is no chance in the Gospel of John, in the context of this gospel, there's really no chance that Jesus is going to lose his life because he's not reached the determined time where he's going to give that up. He always understands, to the extent that in this story, he knows that this illness is going to lead to something else. We have that at the beginning of chapter 11. And then now he knows that he's died, though the disciples clearly don't. And so that foreknowledge, that ability to understand what is happening, that clarity is always set against, as we've said so many times now, the darkness or the confusion of the disciples who are there. I think one thing worth noting here, though, is this story, Clint, I think lands very powerfully on an early church that is themselves waiting for Jesus to return. Come soon, Lord Jesus. I think this story would have had an unbelievable, powerful impact on the people who counted themselves in the number of saying, hey, Jesus, we're sitting here waiting for you. We're sick. We're in trouble. We're in dire circumstances. Are you going to come? And here Jesus delays for just a few days. And why? Lazarus certainly didn't know that. Mary Martha didn't know that. But now Jesus has predetermined there's a glorification, a plan, a providential work that is going to be done because of this circumstance. Jesus knows it, and that would be of great comfort to the Christians who themselves, I think, were really in a circumstance of waiting, in a trouble and a trial in their own time. So I do believe that this story that comes to us has a powerful significance as the people who would have first heard it would have found in it, I think, a great comfort.
It seems to me that it would be hard to read this story and not ask the question, why doesn't Jesus go right away? And
Yeah.
I think, not to oversimplify it, but your answer, I would say, Michael, is really the only answer you can give from John's perspective. It wasn't time. Jesus is unhurried in his mission. Jesus knows what to do. Jesus knows when it's time to do those things. And as Jesus hears the news about Lazarus, he doesn't feel compelled as if he could only get there fast enough, he could help. Jesus knows that he has the power over life and death, and that he will speak life when he gets there. And I think when we are troubled by these details, which is a natural outcome of the way the story's told, I also think that's an opportunity to see through John's perspective that this isn't an issue for Jesus. In this gospel, Jesus does what he's supposed to do when he's supposed to do it. And absolutely, does that have resonance? Does that land on a community that is saying, hey, I thought Jesus was coming right away to bring life. Where's this eternal life? Early on in the chapter, you said we got this, would live forever, and his life was light and light of the world. And why isn't that happening yet? And the simple answer that John might again provide is that's to God's glory and in God's time. And so there may be a lesson beyond the obvious story of the text here. I think that's a really good insight.
Well, just verse 11, what I just point out really, really quickly here. That language of fallen asleep is really a substantial statement of faith that the early church repeats, and that we actually find in later New Testament letters as well. So I just want this to be clear. That's such a striking statement, Clint, the idea that Jesus is saying a person who has died, who has ceased living, you can't emphasize that enough so that you get the force of it. A person who you stand at the grave, in this case, when they get there, we're not there in the story yet, but he's going to be in the grave, right? And and the reality is, when you say this person is merely asleep, it's just a temporary moment. That kind of statement is a powerful witness to the Christian theology, which is simply the vocabulary word we use to say the thing that we believe about the reality of resurrection, about what God is going to do. And Clint, I think many of us are going to be surprised. We don't generally think about this, but the first encounter with death that is reversed in the New Testament account here in John is not going to be the resurrection of Jesus. And not to spoil the story that is to come, but just to say that this idea of falling asleep is planted right here in chapter 11 of John. We have a lot more chapters to come, and John's already having Jesus give us teaching about that thing. And that's a really significant addition and a significant learning for the church as it matures and as we study who Jesus is.
Think not only that, Michael, but the second half of that verse, I am going there to awaken him, not to see what I can do,
Yeah,
not
right.
to share with the grief, not to pass my condolences on to his sisters. Everybody in this story from this point on is going to assume that this is a death story. But Jesus, from the very first instance, knows it's a life story. Even the disciples are, if you go there, they might kill you. And Thomas says, I'll go with you. Let's go with him and we'll die too. Jesus is the only one in the story who even remotely considers that this is a life story, that this is about living and not death, not dying. And that's going to be even more prevalent, I think, as we move through the story. But it is a credit to John, and it's what we've always said about this gospel. He's not into surprising us. If you listen to Jesus, you know where he's fallen asleep, and he will be all right. I am going there to awaken him.
Well, and just one final note here, because realizing, you're gonna have to come back to the next study to see the next and really important part of this story. But I just want to point out that there are some amazingly consistent themes throughout this book, and we see it again and could so easily pass by. Because Clint, verses 9 and 10 here in red, that they are not particularly easy in terms of just following with the narrative, right? Because we have this person who's really sick. He's a friend of Jesus. Jesus has been asked to meet the person. He's holding back, right? We kind of want to push that story ahead. Would be our proclivity, but instead, John records this lesson about the daylight. Those who are walking at night, they stumble because they don't stumble if they see the light of the world. But here's the crazy thing, verse 10, the very end of it, because the light is not in them. Remember how this book began? Jesus is the light of the world who took on flesh. He came to be with us. And now we have this idea that the light is in them, that the light can actually be part of your experience of the world, that you can see clearly as the light has now come. And I think that that is the amazing consistency of this book. It continues to weave these themes back through. Is it always seamless? I don't think it is. I think it is in many ways much more like a patchwork kind of quilt, where these things get sort of blended in and put in together. And you see how they're all supposed to inform one another, that their proximity is not accidental. And so here, once again, you have not just the idea of sleep, not just the idea of death, not just the idea of what's going to happen, resurrection, providence, God's glory. You also have, once again, this idea of darkness and light. What do we see and not see? What do we believe? Do we not believe? What are we going to discover about who Jesus is through the actions he's about to take? And that is just sort of mashed and melded right into this story here. So it's a part of it from the very start.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is a familiar story. This part of the story might be difficult to read devotionally, but I think it does ask some questions as to what do we understand Jesus' timing to be, and are we willing to wait and look to him? And what do we think would be beyond Jesus' limits? These people that have seen these incredible things still have far to go to understand the depth of and the power of this man that they think they're getting to know. And so this is an eye-opening kind of story. And I think in this part of the story, though it gets easier later, it's still there. And I think those lessons still function in this part of the narrative.
Surely, if it's true for them, it's also true for us. So certainly hope you'll continue with us along this journey through the Gospel of John as we turn to such an important part of this story. We're going to continue that next Monday. And friends, certainly give this video a like if it has been interesting, challenging. If there's something in it that you think others might want to see, it helps them find it. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks,
we'll see
everybody.
you soon.